Hello everyone. In this video, we discuss two advanced machine learning models, decision trees and random forests. Let's get started with decision trees. A decision tree is a non-parametric supervised machine learning algorithm, which means that we can use decision trees for both classification and regression problems. For motivating decision trees, we typically use classification problems because they're a little bit easier to understand. But later on in this video, we're going to discuss a regression data set and how we can use decision trees. So what does it mean when we say a decision tree is a non-parametric algorithm? So this means that the structure of the tree, and if we don't know what tree, looks like, this is something that we have here. I will discuss this in more details, but the structure of this tree, such as the number of nodes that we have, the depth of this tree, etc., these things are not fixed beforehand. And we're going to actually learn that from the data itself. Therefore, decision trees are very popular because we do not have to make a lot of strong assumptions about the structure of the data. For example, unlike previous cases, we do not need to use, for example, polynomial features, etc. In this case, we can just use the features that we have and automatically learn the best way to classify them. So now going back to the structure of this tree, we have three types of nodes here. We have the root node, we have these intermediate or internal nodes, and then we have these leaf nodes. So I think here the definition is very clear using this figure that we have. So the root node is where we start to perform classification, meaning that we have our entire data set and we want to initiate the splitting process. So what do we mean here? Meaning that based on like one of the features or predictors, we want to put a condition, for example, whether feature one is less than or equal to some number. And based on that, we get true or false. And that's why this is called a binary decision tree. And then now we can put further conditions on that feature or other features that we have in our data set. And this takes us to these intermediate nodes, right? So intermediate or internal nodes are very much similar to the root node, but they are sort of what we usually call these are children of the root node, right? So that's how we get from the root node to these intermediate nodes. And in this case, we have further conditions on exactly the same feature or other features, and we split the data again. And these branches that you see, these are the outcomes of these tests or conditions, meaning that in the simplest case, if we have like a binary scenario, we have true or false, and this takes us to two different nodes. And eventually we have these leaf nodes, or we call these terminal nodes, that they represent the final output or prediction of our model. So this means that if we have classification problems, we're going to get labels for those data points that end up in those leaf nodes in these sort of like terminal nodes. And if it's sort of like if it's a regression problem, then we're going to have some continuous values that are included inside these leaf or terminal nodes. So this is a very big picture about what a tree is, if this is something very new to you, this idea of root, intermediate, and leaf nodes, and also the idea of the depth of a tree. So the depth is the number of levels that we have. Usually the root is at level 0, and then these two are at level 1, and in this case, all these leaf nodes or terminal nodes are at level 2. But remember, in general, you can have many, many different levels. So, but in this case, we have, if we ask you what's the depth of this tree, the depth of this tree is 2. So in order to understand decision trees, we're going to look at the result of a trained decision tree on a data set that we have seen before. This is this iris flower data set where we have a multi-class classification. We have three species of the iris flower. And these species are Setosa, versicolor, and virginica. And it's a very nice data set because we have 50 samples per class or category here, and thus we have a total of 150 samples. And if you remember from our previous lectures, in this case, so these are the targets that we are trying to predict, but we want to do these based on four features: sepal length and width, and petal length and petal width. And to make this simpler, obviously we can use all these features, but to make this problem simpler and easier to understand, let's only work with sepal length and petal length and petal width. These are the ones that we are keeping. So we keep petal length and petal width, and we're going to exclude sepal length and sepal width. So the result of this trained decision tree is what we have here. So again, we have our root node, we have our intermediate nodes here, and these are like our leaf nodes here that we have these three classes, and we are showing these using three colors that we have here. So let's do this step by step. So what's happening in our root node? In our root node, we are going to pick one of the features. And in this case, again, remember, we are only working with petal length and petal width. And in particular, in root node, we are working with petal length. And we are asking whether this number or this feature is less than or equal to 2.45 or not. So where did we get this number from? This is from the training process. So in general, we do not know this, but we train this model to learn what this threshold should be. And then we get this number, which is called Gini. So what does this mean? So we have the mathematical formula in a few minutes, but what Gini is, it shows how pure this category or class that we have here is. So in this case, because we just started splitting the data, this node contains the entire data set, which has 150 samples and 50 samples per class. So that's what you can see here. And therefore, if I ask you what's the predicted class or label for this node, you just randomly pick one of the three classes or species that we have. So for example, you can say that this is Setosa. But as you can see, this is not very informative because we just started to split the data based on the features. It becomes more interesting when we go to the next level, right? So this is level one, according to the definition that we have. And there are two branches, right? True or false. If it's true, meaning that, yeah, if the petal length is less than or equal to 2.45, right, then we can see that all the samples that they end up in this node or in this location, they all actually belong to the class Setosa, right? So we have 50 of them, and then 0 and 0 for the two other species. So you can think of this kind of as the confusion matrix that we had before. And therefore, in this case, it's very easy to say that all of these, they belong to class Setosa. And also, if you look at the Gini score, is 0, which means that this is very, very pure. This is the extreme case where we have a completely pure sort of like node because they all belong to the same class. And so since we do not need to do any more splitting here, and this is the terminal node, we immediately call this the leaf node, right? So that's like one of the three species or categories that we have. However, if petal length is not less than or equal to 2.45, which means that it's greater than 2.45, it seems that we need to now have another condition based on the other feature that we have in this problem, which is the petal width. So we're going to, again, find this number through training. And once we figure out this is, for example, 1.75, now we're going to see that we can now split this again into two groups based on whether this condition here is true or false. And if it's true, which means that the petal width is less than or equal to 1.75, then we can see that we have 49 data points from the versicolor category and 5 from Virginica. And so what this means is that, yes, this is a good sort of like, a split of data into these sort of like class. We have a few misclassified points, but if we calculate the Gini score because that's how we here, we can calculate whether a split is good or not based on this purity score. It is 0.168, which is, close enough to 0. And another way to look at this is that we started from zero point 0.5 and we got to 0.168, right? So this means that, yeah, we had a good drop in the Gini score. So, and that's a good thing. And if this condition here, petal width less than or equal to 1.75 is false, which means that it is greater than 1.75, then you can see that now we can recognize the Virginica class. And we have one misclassified point here, but still, if we consider the Gini score, we get something that is even closer to 0, is 0.043. So again, let's see how we did this. We started with the two input features, petal length and petal width. And this was our choice in this case to start with these two features. We could include all four, but then you had a tree that probably is deeper. But in this case, we started with this and we saw that, yeah, we can find 3 leaf nodes and each leaf node like corresponds to one class or category. And you can exactly say what the condition is to end up in one of these leaf nodes. So here I have the full description of this, like how each sort of like node here works. So we have the root node, and then we have the left child of root. So that's this orange one. And then we have the right child of this root node. And then we have the left child of internal or intermediate node and right child of internal node. So that's how we work with trees in general. This is something very popular in many areas of machine learning and computer science in general to work with trees because of this hierarchical structure that we have. So now I want to explain a little bit more what that Gini impurity is, that score that you saw in those nodes that we always look at them. So it's a measure of how mixed the classes are. So if they are not mixed and we have all the data points from one class, then of course it's very pure and Gini should be 0. But you can see that in general, the higher the Gini score, means that the more mixed the node is, right? And in order to find this exactly, if you're looking for a specific mathematical formula, is that let's say S is the set of samples that you have at each node, and Sk is the subset of samples in class K. So K here is the index to show which class we're talking about. And so you can use the relative frequency definition of probability to find the probability that one data point belongs to class K. And that's the total number of data points that belong to class K divided by the total of number of samples at that node, right? So that's the proportion of samples in class K. It's a number between 0 and 1. It's a probability score. And then you can find the Gini by summing these pKs times 1 minus pk for each class K. And you can also show that you can simplify this and write this as 1 minus summation of pk squared over k. So it's a very sort of like should be easy to prove this, and I definitely encourage you to do that. So now, in order to discuss decision trees, I gave you a trained model or a trained tree. But in this case, let's actually do the training to see how this works. And we use scikit-learn's implementation of decision trees, which is inside the tree module. So obviously, this is where you have tree-based models. And we can use decision tree classifier. And beyond that, we do the similar things that we have done. So we're going to import the data, look at the two features, look at the targets, and then the syntax is very similar. We have to, in this case, initiate our decision tree classifier class. And as I said, one of the most important things you always want to kind of think about is that although the depth of the tree is learned from the data itself, you can put a limit on how deep the tree can be. And that's usually a very good practice because you don't want to have trees that are extremely deep because then you probably end up with nodes that only have a few data points in them. And that's not ideal. So you want to have, the depth of the tree to be controlled in some ways. And once you instantiate this, we can use .fit. And so one thing I want to do in this case is to visualize the behavior of this classifier to understand how this works. So we have done this again before too. One thing that we can do is we can create a two-dimensional grid for this petal length and petal width. And you can look at the data set and see what are the minimum and maximum values that you have. So in this case, I've done this. So for petal length, we have 0 to 7.2, and I select 100 equally spaced points. Similarly for the petal width. And now the goal is to create a two-dimensional grid, meaning that to create 10,000 data points, because 100 times 100 is 10,000, where these are the X and Y coordinates. And then we will see what our classifier predicts for each coordinate, right? So that's exactly where we concatenate these lengths and widths to create a two-dimensional grid. And then we ask our classifier to tell us what the label is for this two-dimensional grid that we have. And then in order to make this nicer in terms of visualizing this, I'm using contour plot. So I provide again the XY coordinates, the labels, right? So we get this nice plot. And also I'm going to visualize the training data points too. So again, these are the XY coordinates. And don't forget to put the labels for X and Y axes. So once we run this cell, you can see that, this makes a lot of sense, right? This is exactly the same thing as what we had in that decision tree that you saw before when we look at the tree structure. So this tells us we have petal length and petal width. So when petal length is less than or equal to this number, right? And this number, I think we can find this here because we just had this information is 2.45. So when petal length is less than 2.45, you can see all these data points belong to this Setosa class. So in general, if we have a new testing data point that is anywhere here, that's going to be predicted as having this label Setosa. However, it's a little bit more complicated when you're looking at the other two species, right? Because you can see that in this case, you have some of these green points here and here around this blue box. So this means that in this case, we cannot just simply say that anything like less than 5 belongs to the blue class and anything greater than 5. So we have to be a little bit more so like detail. So according to the training data points that we have that you can see here, the logical thing to do is actually have this smaller square here. So that's your blue class or versicolor. And then you have this bigger sort of like, virginical class. So that's how this works, right? So it's a decision tree. It works based on these conditions on length and width. And one of the reasons that this is very popular is because it's very easy to understand how it works, right? It's based on binary conditions and whether they're true or false. So what is, again, like, we just use scikit-learn, but I want to make sure that we understand a little bit more how this works. So in scikit-learn, this is known as classification and regression trees algorithm, or for short, they call this CART algorithm, right? Classification and regression trees. And the idea is that we're going to use binary trees, and binary here means that we have this true-false condition. So each node only has two children. In general, it can have more complex conditions, but the simplest thing is you ask a question and the answer is yes or no. And based on that, you get two children nodes. And this allows us to recursively split nodes based on these features that yield the most information gain. And what this means is that if, for example, you do classification, you can look at this Gini score, which shows us like the impurity, and see how you can have the maximum reduction in Gini score. That means that we get the most information gain. Okay, so now we understand kind of like the big picture here. So for each node, you consider different features and you can see where you can get the most pure or homogeneous children nodes. And if you're using the classifier version, you can use decision tree classifier. If you're using the regression version, you can use decision tree regressor. And there are a lot of parameters that are very similar, except probably the criteria, right? So criteria here is kind of like, think about that as your loss function. If you're using classification, a very popular choice, again, is Gini impurity. If you're using regression, is a squared error, which is mean squared error. So in this case, each node has one predicted label, and you have different data points with different labels in that node, and you consider the differences, or I would better say to square differences between those values and the predicted label for that specific node, right? So regression part is a little bit easier, of course, because you're working with continuous targets. And then we have this important parameter, which is called a splitter. So what the splitter is, you have two main choices. Like best means that you want to choose the best split. And what does best split means? Means the most information gain. And then there is something called random, which is the best random split. So what does this mean? So what if I want to explain this right now, what it means is that instead of working with all the features and trying to find the best one, you first randomly select a subset of features, and then you try to find the best one in that subset, right? So you don't want to necessarily look at the entire set of features all the time. And the reason for this is that we're going to talk about this when we talk about random forest, is because sometimes you want to have multiple trees and you want to have these trees to be as diverse as possible. So you don't want to necessarily use the same strategy to form them. And one easy way to do this is that once you want to do this data splitting, you don't want to look at the entire set of features. You want to look at some random subsets and do the best for the random subsets. So hopefully this way you get a more diverse set of trees. That's the idea. And max depth, we discussed this. It's very important. It helps you identify the maximum depth of the tree, and this is very essential to avoid overfitting. I'm going to show you in the next cell when we talk about that regression version of decision trees, what this means exactly based on the Buzz variance trade-off that we had before and controlling model complexity. But before then, I want to also say that there are other options too. For example, the minimum number of samples that are required to split an internal node, or the minimum number of samples required to be at a leaf node. And the reason is very simple, right? So if you have a leaf node, like for example, like these ones here, where you only have one sample, and that one sample obviously belongs to one of these classes, that doesn't tell us very much because you only work with one sample. So ideally, you want to make sure that you have a sufficient number of samples to give them the same label. Otherwise, obviously, yes, for each data point, we can find a label, but we want to group or classify them together. So that's why you can control that if you think that, for your specific problem, the tree that you find is not reasonable. So let's talk a little bit about that decision tree regressor. So in this case, I really want to do this using a synthetic data set, and I'm going to create a bunch of randomly distributed data points from 0 to 5. The way I do this, I use np.random.rand. This gives me 80 random numbers from 0 to 1. Obviously, if you multiply that by 5, then you get things from 0 to 5. And then I'm going to use this sign of x. And then we add this noise, sort of to make this a little bit more interesting. And then in this case, also, I want to create a test set. And for my test set, I'm going to use 500 equally spaced points from 0 to 5. So I want to get a really nice shape of the behavior of this predicted function for the testing data. And the main thing that we're going to change in this problem is this max depth. So I'm going to set that to be 1, 3, 5, and 10. So we want to start from very simple models that are really shallow to models that they get deeper and deeper up to 10 different levels, right? So this means that now we can have a lot of different numbers of splits. And then we're going to, for each value of depth, we're going to train this decision tree regressor. And we're going to do then model.predict for each model that we train and look at these predicted values for each case. So since I have 4 different values of max depths here, I'm going to create a 2x2 subplot, so one for each case. And we're going to look at the behavior of these predicted sort of values for different values of max depth from 1, 3, 5, 10. So we see something very interesting, right? So when the max depth is 1, right? So this is a very simple case, meaning that you only have 2 leaf nodes or terminal nodes. And this means that each leaf node has 1 value, so you can have only 2 different distinct predicted values. And the way this works is that it's this nice kind of a step function where you get something like close to 0.6 here. And then if the value of X, your input feature is greater than this like 3-ish number here, you get something like negative 0.6 or 7 here. As you can see, this is a very, obvious case of underfitting, which means that in this case, the model is not complex enough. And obviously, the model in this case has high bias, right? Because we have a hard time to even capturing the true trend in the data. But the variance of your model is really, really low here because obviously it doesn't change very much, it has only two different values. Then when we increase this max depth to 3, now you can see that we get a better representation of this true function, this blue curve here, which is that sine function. And you can see that we have now, because we have a hard depth tree, we get a large number of distinct values. And we can continue doing this if we want to. So we can consider max depth 5. So you can see that now we have more variability in the predicted values. And if we go to like some extreme value, like let's say depth 10, you can actually see something very interesting. So we are doing a really good job of going through the training data, but obviously we have a lot of oscillations here, a lot of wiggling around this like sine function that we have, which means that the model is kind of memorizing the training data rather than capturing that sine function that we have in the background. And so that's obviously a case of overfitting because you can see that in this case we have high variance because the model changes very quickly and a small change in the test data can result in significantly different outputs or predicted values. So you can see why that max depth is a very important parameter. We can even analyze this furthermore if we want to. So we can actually visualize trees like the one that we had originally that we look at it to discuss decision trees. And that's also part of this tree module inside scikit-learn, and it's called plot tree. So once you train your model, like here I'm using, for example, depth 1, I definitely encourage you to, experiment with this code, consider other depths too. I want you to do that to see how this decision tree looks like. And in this case, you can see that, after you train your model, you can use this plot underscore tree. You provide your trained model and a few sort of like optional arguments if you want. But what is very important, so in this case, you see that this is our tree when the depth is equal to 1. So the condition that we have on the input, right, so on this x, is that whether x is less than or equal to 3.186. So now we know that this point here on the x-axis is 3.186. And if that's the case, if it's true, we have 54 samples. Remember, originally we had 80 training data points, and that's the value that we assign to them because that's kind of like gives us the smallest value of mean squared error for this sort of like 54 samples. And if we have this condition to be false, which means that x is now greater than 3.186, then we have this value of negative 0.754, right? So that's this negative 0.754 that we can see here. And similarly, again, if you change the depth here, you can see that you can now have a tree with 3 levels, 5, 10. At some point, you probably have to really zoom in to see these sort of like numbers on these decision trees. But right now, we can easily see everything because this is only max depth 1. So what are the advantages of decision trees? Why should we even learn about them? So it's very nice because this is exactly how we usually make decisions, right? It's very natural for us to think about these types of like binary conditions, right? When we want to make decisions. And also trees can be visualized graphically, like one we had here, which is very nice and easy to communicate the result of your model to even non-experts, right? Because everybody can look at these and explain why the model predicts in the way that it does. And also, the other nice thing is that decision trees can naturally handle categorical or qualitative predictors. So in this case, we don't have to necessarily work with numerical predictors or quantitative predictors. If you have something that is, let's say, two different cases and they're not numbers, still we can put conditions and say whether it's true or false. But what are the disadvantages of decision trees? So Compared to some more advanced models in general, like for example, like neural networks or some other types of models like Gaussian processes, etc., a single decision tree can sometimes be not as accurate as other advanced models. And the other also important part, and I think the second reason is even more important, is that decision trees can be non-robust, which means that if you make a small changes to your training data, like if you remove a few points or add a few points, you can get drastically different tree structures, meaning that at some points you may have, let's say, one feature as the most important one in the root node. Sometimes if you just remove a few points, you may get a different result. You can, for example, maybe visualize this here when you have like these two or three green points here. If you remove these, right, it might get like a completely different behavior here because then we may assign all these points here to the blue class. Whereas now, because of these extra points, that's not the case, right? So again, it can be very sensitive to just a few data points that we have. And in order to, address these problems, that's what we use this idea of, so like using random forest. So what is random forest? So random forest belongs to a family of machine learning models, which is called ensemble learning. And there are different ways of doing ensemble learning. One way is this thing called bagging. And bagging stands for bootstrap aggregating. So if you had some statistics courses before, I'm sure you're familiar with the name bootstrap or search that in Wikipedia. It's a very simple but practical statistical technique. But the idea is very simple. So what is bootstrap sampling? If you have a data set of size n, like this data set that we used so far, we can create copies of this data set or replicates of this data set. And we show this number by B. So we have B replicates right now. And each replicate uses sampling with replacement. So what does this mean? It means that I have n data points. I'm going to do random sampling with replacement, which means that now I have these copies, and in each copy, I can actually have more than one version of each data point, right? So that's the idea of perturbing the original data to create copies. And here the key is that we use this sampling with replacement. So now you have technically with this bootstrap sampling, B training data sets. And so now we can train a separate model on each bootstrap sample. And I show this with f of b, and this is a small b, where it can be anywhere from 1 to uppercase b. And now we're going to, in the prediction stage, we're going to aggregate the result, right? That's why it's called bootstrap aggregating or bagging. And so if it's a regression problem, it's simple, it's just the average of bunch of numbers because we're working with continuous values. If it's classification, we usually use majority wording, meaning that, for example, which class has the highest representation among all the bootstrap models. And that's exactly the idea behind random forest. So what is the idea? You have a bunch of trees, right? That's what the forest is. So you have a bunch of trees. Each tree is trained on a bootstrap sample. And there's only one sort of like, technical thing that we have to be careful here is that, these trees, because we want to be as diverse as possible, instead of considering all features at each split, we work with a randomly selected a subset of these features. And that's exactly that idea of random split or random best split that we had before, right? So when we got here, I said that we have like the best and the random version or the random version, which we call the best random subset of features. And that's exactly why we have that option, because we want to make sure that the trees that we have, they're trained in a way that they are as diverse as possible or as distinct as possible. And that's one way of doing this. So one way we want, there are two things here. One is we use bootstrap samples. And the second part of this is that we're going to select a random subset of these features, and then we try to find the best feature that gives us the most information gain according to Gini or some other criteria that we have. So that's something important to recall when we talk about random forest. And the nice thing is that random forest is also something that's been implemented in scikit-learn. We can use random forest classifier or random forest regressor. And this is part of scikit-learn's ensemble module. So that's something important to remember. Even though there are technically tree-based models, but because they are, mainly like, considered an ensemble model, that are inside this ensemble module. And you can import these random forest classifier for classification and random forest regressor for regression problems. And I would say the most important thing you need to really here specify is n underscore estimators, which means that how many trees do we want to have in our forest, right? And the default is 100, but you can also increase this if you think it's helpful for your problem. So this is a hyperparameter that you have to set before starting the training process. So 100, 200, 500, etc. And there are also other sort of like, options we can use, like max features, like the maximum number of features that we want to consider for each split. So remember, here we are working with subset of features. So, we can consider like a number which is the square root of the total number of features, or like 1/3 of the total number of features. So you have all these options. So you end up hopefully with more sort of like distinct trees at the end where you do sort of like aggregating your predicted predictions. And we can also decide if you want to work with bootstrap samples or not. I mean, by default we should use it, and that's where you can see it's the default. And you can also set the max depth if you want to kind of like control that. And again, we're going to again look at the same, synthetic data set when we have this sign data and some random noise with 80 training data points. So it's very much the exact same setting. And in this case, you can see that we're using random forest regressor from scikit-learn's ensemble module. And we're going to train both a tree model and a random forest model. The difference is that in the random forest, now we have 100 trees that we're going to aggregate the result. We're going to feed these two models, then we do predictions. And now we're going to look at the behavior of this predicted function for both decision trees and random forest. So remember, in this case, we're working with only max depth 10, but you can do this with any number of sort of like levels that you want. So that's something you can definitely experiment with. And so in this case, let's see what happens. So I intentionally chose 10. So we know that with 10, when we have decision tree, we have a lot of wiggling here and a lot of like oscillations here. But interestingly, you can see that when we are using random forests, because of that ensembling and bootstrapping and also those like random subset of features, now we get a result, this like green curve here, is much more smoother than what we have when we use decision tree. And usually this is very ideal, right? Because we want to have models that they have control variability in their output space. They are not changing rapidly with the small changes in the input. And that's definitely something we see when we are using random forest regressor. I hope you found this video helpful.